What I would also say is that I've recently become quite concerned at the extent to which the left seems to be advocating or implicitly advocating restraining economic growth or even advocating degrowth.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/The Rational View. Together, we can make a better future.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm going to play devil's advocate and look at the flaws on the left of the political spectrum. I'm always trying to challenge my biases and poke holes in my positions by listening to opposing opinions, but it's often very easy to reduce that bias when seeing opinions that you agree with. I've recently been butting heads with a UK professor over social media on several issues, as he's been posting what I would consider biased right-wing positions, and I've been challenging him. And sometimes he's right and sometimes I'm right. We're both in agreement on many issues, however, that may come as a surprise to those people currently on the left of the political spectrum. This is a job for The Rational View. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. Give me some love. Come join us on Facebook, and you can also participate in these discussions. I'm also on LinkedIn, and love to hear from you. Dr. Anton Van Der Merwe is a professor of molecular immunology at the University of Oxford. He's been on the left his entire life, from membership of the ANC while in South Africa to membership of the Labour Party since living in the UK. He's also a passionate environmentalist. He's recently expressed dismay at how the left and environmental groups have abandoned science and replaced it with dogma. Welcome, Dr. Van Der Merwe, to The Rational View.
Thank you.
So you've recently been, I would say, highly critical of the collective left of the political spectrum. Your claim that the left have abandoned science and replaced it with dogma, I think, will surprise many on the left. I think we've both argued strongly against the practical drawbacks of renewable energy transition in favor of nuclear energy as a stable, reliable power source without fossil fuels. What other specific incidents do you see dogma replacing science?
Well, just with regard to the topic of climate change, obviously we agree on the fact that nuclear power is likely to be better at replacing fossil fuels than intermittent renewables for technical reasons. But what I would also say is that I've recently become quite concerned at the extent to which the left seems to be advocating or implicitly advocating restraining economic growth or even advocating degrowth as something that would be acceptable or possibly desirable. To me, that is incredibly damaging as an idea, given how we know that economic growth is so important for quality of life and improved life expectancy across the world. And anything that restrains economic growth essentially means accepting more economic misery and increasing mortality and reducing life expectancy. So I think that idea of degrowth and restrained growth is anathema to someone on the left. And I define the left as people who are particularly interested in the welfare of everyone, particularly the more disadvantaged, so that they can improve. And this applies to the whole planet, everyone. people that are particularly concerned about encouraging or enhancing the prospects of the most disadvantaged, either in their society or across the world, and using the instruments that we have in government, for example, and supranational institutions to advance that. That's my idea of what being left-wing is.
Sure. And I think, I've also had a few podcasts looking at degrowth. I interviewed Zion Lights regarding, the dangers of that degrowth idea. There is, I think, something to be said for balancing limitless economic growth with sustainability. I think to a certain extent, our economic system is ignorant of sustainability in the way it's implemented, and this has caused a lot of problems. So I think, this is one of the reasons why I advocate for nuclear energy as a non-carbon clean source of energy that does provide stable decoupling moving forward. And certainly just stopping all fossil fuels without a replacement is recipe for disaster. But also, I think, on the same footing as carbon in the atmosphere is also land use. And I think, much of the environmental problems we find with biodiversity and wildlife extinctions is more caused by land use changes than caused by climate changes. But you see in the news, all of this is foisted on climate change as the bogeyman. Or you see, I think, a lot of people are trying to frame climate change as the reason for much of the extinction. But I did an episode on the insect Armageddon story, and I looked at the science papers, and none of them were able to implicate climate change. They say, climate change may be causing migration of animal species, and if you're doing a count in a certain place of a certain species, then that may be implicating the results. But most of these things implicated land use changes and cutting down of forests and clear cutting.
And I agree. Just to briefly comment on the question of economic growth. Obviously, uncontrolled, reckless economic growth is a problem if you damage your environment to such an extent that it's unsustainable. But what is clearly happening in developed countries, or as countries develop, is that the environmental footprint per unit of GDP tends to contract, essentially. So people are urbanizing, and therefore agriculture becomes more efficient. So land use for agriculture reduces, and the energy use is gradually becoming cleaner. And obviously, that there's no reason why that trend can't continue, in my view, so that you can end up with a situation where you have very high levels of economic growth and people are very well fed, but you're actually living on a much smaller footprint than before. And in a sense, energy is the key to that, because living in cities and having increasing areas of countryside made available is enhanced by having lots of energy. There are all sorts of developments in the pipeline for agriculture, for example, that will allow 3D agriculture, so that you could actually grow many of the plants and vegetables indoors using energy to provide light. So
I just want to say, that I agree that you are right that the footprint per unit GDP is decreasing, but we also have to be aware of Jevon's paradox, where if things become cheaper, we use more of them. And even though we're decreasing the intensity, the population will increase to get back to beyond the carrying capacity, as it were. So we need to be, I think, careful of growth without limits.
That's absolutely true. But the thing that's quite striking is that fertility is dropping, and it seems to be dropping everywhere along with economic growth. So if anything, there's more of a concern now that, we'll be shrinking so fast that it'll be actually quite difficult to manage. So the notion that overpopulation is going to be a problem, I think we need to pretty much put that aside, because in every single country, fertility is either below replacement level or is dropping surprisingly fast. So I don't think we should worry about population. Of course, as you probably know, the reason why environmentalists opposed nuclear energy initially, certainly in the Sierra Club, was because they were worried that abundant, cheap energy would allow population increases in California and other parts of the US, and they thought that population was very negative for the environment. So they were motivated not because they thought nuclear energy was harmful to the environment, but they thought that people were harmful to the environment. I think we need to drop that.
Oh, they were at that point.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that humans have always, even from 10,000 plus years ago, had huge impacts on the environment. The megafauna extinctions, for example, were all quite small numbers of humans coming in and hunting these animals that had no fear of humans and making them all extinct. So that's absolutely true. But I actually think we're on a trajectory now. Certainly, if you look at developed countries, where the environmental situation, broadly speaking, is improving, in the sense that if you look at the amount of farmland that's used, if you look at species, major species, you see lots of endangered species are becoming less endangered because of conservation changes. If you look at energy footprint, that's gradually shrinking. And of course, population is shrinking. So I think we've turned the corner, at least in developed countries. And there's no obvious reason why developing countries shouldn't follow the same pattern. So from my point of view, the most important thing to do is focus on what allows economic growth while reducing the footprint on the environment. And in that sense, I'm very disturbed that some of the obvious things, so from the environmental point of view, such as it's completely, all ecologists and people who study extinction agree that it's habitat loss that's the cause of extinction. It's the biggest threat. So anything that reduces our footprint, or conversely, anything that increases human use of habitats is an extinction threat. And that's why I'm dismayed by the fact that, in this country we are, and in Europe, we are using biofuels, which have an enormous environmental footprint in terms of the amount of area needed to grow, to produce a certain amount of energy. It's completely insane to use biofuels to generate electricity. And yet that seems to be, considered renewable. And that's an example of, given something the name renewable, it's just not sustainable. If we expanded biofuel use to the extent that might be needed to replace fossil fuels as the alternative, we would have a devastating effect on species because of the huge increase in farm. So the whole process of reducing agricultural land and rewilding, which is happening in developed countries, that would go into reverse. Or we'd accelerate agricultural use of land, or clearing forests, for example, instead of doing the opposite, which is necessary for the environment. So if you care about the environment, you should absolutely be opposed to, in my view, biofuels. It's insane.
And it's also been, I think, in the global south, the clearing of land for livestock and supporting the global north is still a problem. We need to address that because, obviously that's much of the global forests are being cleared in the Amazon and in the rainforests of the world to create low quality agricultural lands to support our lifestyles.
And the best way to do that is to be honest, is to move to lower levels of meat consumption. Meat consumption, particularly red meat, requires vast amounts of land, and it really isn't that difficult to reduce meat consumption, and it's something that most people in the West, I think, are gradually doing. I mean, it also has a benefit that it's healthy we eat too much meat, so those are sort of fairly straightforward ways that we could to reduce our land use.
Sure.
Let's move on. There are alternatives to meat, and there are forms of meat that have a much lower land use than others. Like, pork and chicken, for example, is much more land efficient than beef and sheep. And so even there are quite simple things that can be done.
So I think we've covered the areas where we have violent agreement. Let's move on to some of the more contentious things. So you've been, what I would say, posting right-wing talking points lately online. As a leftist, it becomes a little bit disconcerting to see some of these things. In a recent post, you accused the left of crying wolf regarding the constitutional crisis in the U.S. Why do you feel there is no crisis when a group who allegedly plotted to overthrow an election through slates of fake electors is now running the country?
Well, let me just go back to the period when Trump was first elected. Like everyone else on the left, I think I was extremely dismayed by his popularity and the fact that he won, and extremely concerned about the outcome, and very much taken up by all of the news that was reported about, how bad he was and the terrible things he was doing. And one of the things I got particularly taken up by, for example, was the whole Russia collusion story, which was about essentially how Russia had helped him win the election, essentially, and that he had somehow, they had some hold over him. And to be honest, I was thoroughly convinced that was an issue. And then I became aware of the fact over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years, that whole thing was just essentially a hoax. It was a manufactured story, really, which had a couple of slightly, suspicious things, but really it was not really based on solid fact. And I was quite disappointed by that, because I thought I was quite a critical person and skeptical, but I was completely convinced by that. And it was that realization. And another example that I became aware of was the Biden laptop story. As you know, there was a lot of talk in the media about misinformation and a lot of it coming from Russia, apparently, and how this was persuading voters to believe things which were not true, and that was having a damaging effect on democracy. And there were all these campaigns and organizations that were trying to fight that. There's quite a lot of pressure, and I always supported it, on Facebook and Twitter, to suppress these stories and have fact-checking, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I remember very clearly was in the run-up to the 2020 election, there were these stories circulating that Russia was going to try and upset the election again, like they had supposedly done previously, and throw it by planting stories. And it was a process which was kind of called pre-bunking. This is a good idea. You warn people before that there's this thing. And then there was the Hunter Biden laptop story came up, and everyone was told, well, this is just another Russian hoax, and we should be skeptical. And the whole story was essentially dismissed. It was certainly, and we now know that it was suppressed on social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and that. And, at the time, I didn't think much of it. I thought, but now, subsequently, I've discovered that, in fact, the FBI did slow walk an investigation after being told about this laptop. It did. There were from governments sources, FBI, Homeland Security, USAID, they were pushing the pre-bunking stories out into social media.
I think that's reasonable, though. I mean, that's something
Well,
for sure.
let me just.
We know there are Russian troll farms out there that are trying to sow chaos.
Okay, but then they also strongly, there was a suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story, which would have been very damaging because, it was a sign that the Biden family were not so clean, perhaps, as and that would undermine them, because obviously the main thing against Trump in the eyes of many people was that he was associated with corruption and corrupt people. So if you tarred Biden and it was the same kind of damage, and it would have damaged him. And, in retrospect, that was very much electoral interference.
Do you think it was a reaction to the way they interfered in the previous election by bringing up false allegations about Hillary Clinton's email server just a week before the election?
Well, as far as I recall, there's never really been any convincing evidence that. One thing's for sure is that the FBI made a bit of a cock-up in this 2016 election, by releasing information about Hillary Clinton, which was, didn't look good, and then, but what seems to have happened then is that in response to that cock-up, they decided, well, they better sort of err on the other side and try and, investigate Trump, particularly energetically. But what I'm saying is that both of those things would have been mistakes. Neither of them were good. I was terribly frustrated by the way Hillary Clinton's email stuff was being covered, because I thought it was damaging her chances and that. So, but, in retrospect, I realized that I think there was a wider feeling amongst people who have felt the same way as me, who worked in the FBI, who worked in the press, who then felt that, they had to sort of err on the other side. And they felt justified in pushing a story which made Trump look bad. Probably
what Trump did actually, he's on record calling out to the Russians to interfere during that election.
Well, this is
I'm not surprising that there's suspicion that maybe this is happening.
I remember that, and I remember thinking, my God, this is ridiculous. But, in retrospect, now that I've got used to how he talks and what he does, I realize that was just, it was like taunting. It's Trump. This is one thing I've realized about Trump. I mean, I really dislike the man. He's a horrible person and he's a bully and everything, but he's got a sense of humor, and he makes these kind of comments, and he's provocative intentionally. And the irony is that it's incredibly irritating for people on the left, and they find it jarring, and they hate him for it. But actually, that kind of almost like humorous, taunting, provocative, it's very appealing to the people that support him. And one of the reasons why is because it's quite simple and direct, but also they see it as provocative, and they like the idea of him provoking the left and what I would call the sort of university educated elite that sort of find Trump so repulsive generally. So in a sense, we're making a mistake by overreacting to something like that. It's not really that real. When he says, "Oh, can you?" I mean, if you think about it, it's completely ridiculous to go on national television and say, "Putin, please, steal Hillary Clinton's emails and provide him with."
But I mean, he's got this level of now he can say anything and just claim it was a joke. Like he's been claiming he wants to take over Canada now for the last several months, and and his advisors have talked to Canadian politicians, have gone to the U.S. saying, what the hell, and they said, yes, you have to take him at his word. He means this.
Yeah, look, what I'm saying is that there's a lot of things that he says that he definitely means, and he says them in a very direct way. Like, for example, the whole Gaza thing, that the Palestinians should be cleared out of Gaza. But I think we need to distinguish between those things and what I was talking about earlier, when he's this conspiracy theory, this idea that he's actually trying to collaborate with Russia. I don't think that wasn't a genuine thing. So it gets a bit confusing, and I think part of the confusion is that we don't distinguish between what are kind of not very serious things and what are serious things, which are sometimes said in an unserious way or sound almost like jokes. And it's quite difficult to sort of pass them. But what I think is a mistake is to overinterpret and overreact, particularly, and this is important. And I mean, obviously, this is more important before the election than it is now, but particularly in ways that make the left appear to be almost hysterical and overwrought and say things that are kind of a little bit nuts and certainly off-putting to the working classes. I think we seem to lose track of the fact that there's a much bigger audience out there than our own side. There's also the whole of America, and they see these things quite differently. There's a very good book that I've read recently, which kind of gave me a much more insight into the group that I belong to, which obviously are the university-educated elite, which some people have called the managerial elite. And the person who wrote this book, Musa Al-Gharbi, who's an American sociologist, very left-wing. He's in an East Coast liberal arts university, quite young. And he wrote this book called We Have Never Been Woke. And he describes, first of all, I just say that he supports the things that are associated with woke, so, but he points out that the people that support it very strongly, most strongly, are actually the university-educated elite, who are very, very strongly democratic now. And it didn't used to always be the case. It used to be that actually university-educated people kind of were slightly more Republican, like 30, 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. But now it's become overwhelmingly Democrat. Mm-hmm. And this group, they're well-meaning in the sense that these are good things, to be anti-racist and to be pro-diversity and to be supportive of immigrants and asylum seekers and all these things. But what's happened, and what he argues has happened, is that that this group, there's a tendency for there to be an overproduction of this group at various times. In other words, there are more people coming out of the universities than there are the kind of jobs that they want. And this has happened at several times over the last century. And when this happens, what tends to coincide with that is a kind of inter-elite competition within this group. And one of the ways it manifests itself is that the things that they consider important, being virtuous and supporting the virtuous causes, and that level of support becomes a sign of status, and also becomes a weapon against people that are not as virtuous as you. So you end up with a situation where this group are sort of arguing amongst themselves and battling amongst themselves as who can be the most, virtuous as a way of gaining status, and then also using people that aren't aligned with the most virtuous, using it as a weapon against them. And he actually reminded me of something when I was a student. of a term called trashing. I don't know if you came across
Yes.
it. You remember that? And he says, well, canceling is really just like that, where you take someone who's like part of your group and then you basically demonize them for having some incorrect views, and then they become an outcast and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that this is a form of competition which is not unexpected when you have these groups fighting, because there are not enough jobs around. Interestingly, he points out that the biggest source of this anxiety in the 1968-70 period was this possibility of being called to fight in Vietnam, which the university-educated elite were able to get away with, and then they started introducing the draft in the US, and that caused extreme anxiety that people going to university might have to go to fight, and there was, outrage. So anyway, the point he's trying to make is that when you look at it from that point of view, you start seeing, well, maybe this is why there's such a disconnect between the views of this group and the views of the people that they're supposedly meant to be advocating for, the working classes. Particularly, the distance between their views on certain issues. But you could say that that's not such a huge issue, because if they're good views, then that's fine. The thing that's mostly concerned me is that some of these views, and I think this is the reason why they've become unpopular, some of the views that they have are just harmful to the working classes. And the working
Do you have an
classes,
example?
Sorry?
Could you make an example?
Well, I think the most obvious example, since we've been talking about energy policy, is the sort of net zero thing. This idea that we need to rapidly switch from fossil fuels to mainly renewables, within a fairly short period of time. There's no question that that is expensive, and it's increasing the price of energy, and it's making life more difficult for people who don't have big margins, in terms of spending on cars or spending on electricity or buying fuel or those, paying for heating and that. So this massive rush to reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions is harming the poorest people. It's also harming potentially the developing world, because they're also under enormous pressure to switch from carbon-based fuels to renewables, and this seems insane to me because we haven't been able to do it. We're struggling to replace carbon-based fuels with solar and wind, and where we've done it most, energy prices have gone up a lot, and it's expensive. So that's an example of where I think. I think it's probably for me the most important example of where policies that are very popular amongst the sort of symbolic elite, this group, are actually harming the poorest people in our society. I think one good example of that is in California. They've been quite good at subsidizing solar so that people put solar on their houses, and they've been encouraged by giving them good feed-in tariffs, right? Mm-hmm. But there was a study published last year which showed that basically what this has done is it's reduced electricity prices for people that are wealthy enough to install solar panels on roofs and have roofs to do that. And it's increased electricity prices for people that can't. So it's basically been a wealth transfer from the poorest to the richest. And heads up, good for them. They decided to reduce the feed-in tariffs. I was very angry in the UK when they did the same thing. They had these incredibly generous feed-in tariffs for solar panels, and all the wealthy people were.
It's even worse in Ontario.
Oh, really? All the wealthy are putting these solar panels on their roofs and getting this scoring massively and bragging about how much money they're saving. And of course, it's paid for by everyone else that doesn't have solar panels. And these are people that live in apartments and they don't have the capital to buy solar panels and that. So. That really.
We have extremely cheap hydro and nuclear prices here in Ontario, but they put in hugely expensive feed-in tariffs on wind and solar, drove the price of electricity up. Now everyone, companies are leaving, the electricity bills are through the roof. It's madness.
Yeah, so I think that's the most obvious example to me. But there are other examples where, and these are sometimes I think people might find them more contentious, but these are areas which I know about because of my academic background, and also because from where I come from in South Africa, where I was brought up in an apartheid state, and I experienced obviously very bad racism against black people and people of different colors.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, that was stopped and the government changed, and there was a majority government that came in, a majority black government. And then they introduced affirmative action policies, which are very strong, and they still continue to this day. And what that experience has shown us is that there are big disadvantages from abandoning meritocracy and focusing on affirmative action to the general public, including the poorest people in those countries. So in South Africa, this rapid rush to replace people that were qualified for jobs with people that were less qualified resulted in a massive deterioration in all sorts of government-provided services like electricity, sewage, water, teaching, universities, all of these things. And these affected, in many cases, the poorest people.
Many people would argue that affirmative action is put in place to allow equally qualified people of minorities who are being discriminated against to get jobs.
Well, I don't think look, there's a big difference between eliminating racism and if they're two equally qualified candidates, giving preference to the person who's disadvantaged. I mean, that's a no-brainer. No, what I'm talking about is actually lowering your standards significantly, eliminating qualifications requirements and appointing people just because of their color, essentially. And that's what's happened in South Africa.
Okay. Yeah, I could understand that being very controversial.
It's been particularly dispiriting in the education sector and schooling, where the government tried to basically replace a huge number of teachers that were already employed, allowed them early retirement, and then replaced them with poorly qualified teachers in order to sort of change the racial balance of the educational system. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that was coupled with the fact that the teachers' unions were very strong and very resistant to any kind of efficiency-based reforms. It meant that the quality of schools and teaching at schools actually deteriorated. And so the extent to which disadvantaged people got a good education actually got worse for a time, and it certainly didn't improve as fast as it could have. So it was too much focus on the racial equity amongst teachers and other professions, and not enough focus on making sure that all children had access to the best possible teaching.
I think this kind of leads into the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a polarizing issue right now. It's become a hated target of the right and a holy symbol of the left to include DEI programs. And I think the value of having a diversity of opinions goes without saying, but we've focused on visible minorities, skin color, other aspects. Is this laser focus on one issue damaging? The extremes have dominated the conversation on social media to a certain extent, and I don't think that there's focusing on trans issues, which is such a small minority of the actual problems that we're seeing. Is racial and gender diversity getting too much attention? Is it just because visible minorities are easier to pick out and deal with? Like, what about diversity of religion? Shouldn't atheists get preferential treatment as a discriminated against minority.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say is that there should be no tolerance of any discrimination. That goes without saying. And no group should be treated, I don't think, differently to any other group. And we should also be very tolerant of diversity in terms of religion, ethnic, but I think there has been a tendency to focus on, and I never really understood this until I read a really interesting book. I forget the name of it, but basically what it pointed out was that on the left, a lot of identity politics in universities had sort of adopted some of the ideas from postmodernism, which were very focused on, sort of epistemological questions that you can't really be confident about what is real and what is not. But then what they did is they said, well, there's one thing that you can be confident of, and that is that the world is divided into groups that are more powerful and groups that are less powerful. And the groups that are more powerful, they're the ones that basically create the language and the systems and the ways of doing things and the ways of understanding things that essentially entrench them in power, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it was postmodernism with a twist. The twist was that the only thing that was real was the existence of these groups. And then once you have that framework and you assign, which is not very difficult to do, certain groups to power and certain groups to less power, you end up with a situation where essentially anything that certain groups does is questionable and challengeable and is probably biased because of their position of power, and anything that the other group does, that the ones that are disadvantaged, is good and virtuous and should be paid attention. And from an epistemological and scientific point of view, that opens a way to all sorts of nonsense where you can't really solve problems because you can't come to an agreement of what's wrong with the world. It's just this view is right, or people that say this is right and people that say they're wrong. And the focus becomes who's in the powerful group and who's in the less powerful group. So you end up with this kind of victim Olympics. And it's that kind of framework which developed initially in the humanities, but amazingly, I sort of started seeing it spread to the sciences. And
Yes.
the first time I encountered it, and I couldn't believe it, was the whole debate between trans people and lesbians. Because here you had a situation where you had two groups that were definitely, troubled, persecuted minorities in the past. But I was seeing what was happening, and I saw this in England. I saw this in my own campus. I saw it in other campuses. Lesbians who were objecting to certain aspects of trans ideology were being horribly persecuted as being transphobic and all sorts of terrible things, and literally sort of hounded out of campuses and cancelled. And the sort of things that they were objecting to were quite common sense kind of things. I mean, things like, for example, things that I've now learned more about, but the two things that were most striking for me were the sharing sexual violence shelters, which are female, obviously mostly for women, having to share those with trans women or people who claim to be trans women, that becoming a thing. Which the second, and then there was an extension for that into prisons, and so there were lots of lesbians, particularly, who were very concerned about that, about the fact that basically people that were biologically male were wanting to be placed in these female-only spaces because they were identified as female. So that was the one thing, and I was quite sympathetic to, because I've always been sympathetic to women because of the extraordinary level of sexual violence and other forms of violence that they experience. So when they complain about a risk from having a biological male there, then I listened to them, and what I was getting was that this particular group were considered powerful. Now it was a trans activists that were considered the weaker ones, and so you had to listen to them. They were the ones that counted, and I didn't think that was fair. I think you had to listen to both sides and come to some kind of a compromise. So that was the one example, but it affects a fairly small number of people. But nevertheless, it was an example of this thinking that didn't seem fair, really. But the thing that really disturbed me, and this is something I know about because I did my PhD in molecular reproductive endocrinology, and I actually worked on puberty blockers as part of my PhD. When I realized that puberty blockers, which had been licensed to treat children with precocious puberty. So these are girls and boys particularly girls that are developing puberty so much earlier than normally that it's causing potential problems. So that these puberty blockers basically delay that. And there were clinical trials showing, sorry?
I see, yes.
There were clinical trials showing that they were beneficial for this group. You give them for a couple of years until they reach roughly what is the normal age to go into puberty, and then you allow them to go into puberty. And under those conditions, they were effective and safe, and they were licensed for that. There's a thing in medicine where you're allowed to use licensed drugs off-label. Medical doctors are allowed to do this. They're allowed to use a licensed drug for a different application. It's a bit iffy, if you ask me, but what was happening was that a group in the Netherlands had done an experiment where they took children that right from before puberty had gender dysphoria, or they basically, mostly boys who said that they were girls and have girls things. They decided to do an experiment where they would give these children puberty blockers. And it wasn't a trial. It was it was a single-arm trial. They just gave them puberty blockers and they followed them for a while. And then most of them went on to have cross-sex hormones, and they followed them for a while. And then after about 5 or 10 years, they published the results. And what they basically argued was that these children seemed to do well, on this regime. So these were a very defined group of boys that well before puberty had identified as girls mostly, and then had been given these cross-sex hormones, the puberty blockers, and then after a period of time they were given cross-sex hormones. And of course, there were side effects of this. They were sterile.
Sure.
They were sterile. And the second thing was that it turns out that they had very poor sexual function in terms of inability to orgasm. And then there were also bone development problems. But the idea was that the alternative, which was to not give them these hormones, would have been worse, right? But there was no evidence for that. It was a single arm trial. So they didn't do, one group that got all the sort of supportive therapy and everything and got puberty blockers, another group that didn't. But nevertheless, once that was published, very, very quickly across the Western world, it became something that everyone was doing. They were taking...
Based on this one study.
Based on that one study, yeah. And they hadn't shown, it wasn't the kind of controlled clinical trial that you need to do to get approval. They did it anyway. And despite the fact that there were some very troubling features of that trial. So, for example, previous studies that had followed boys that had gender dysphoria for over many years found that roughly 80 to 90% of them, once they go through puberty, beyond puberty, lose the gender dysphoria. And most of those...
80 to 90%. Wow.
Yeah, most of those. And most of those realize that they're either gay or bisexual, right? So...
Sure.
And that kind of makes sense if you think about it.
Yeah.
So
it's a difficult time, and there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, but this is the thing that was disturbing, is that those single-arm studies that were done in the Netherlands and also elsewhere, where they gave puberty blockers, none of them desisted, and none of them realized that they were basically homosexual or bisexual. In other words, the problem wasn't so much that they were in the wrong body, but they had that kind of whatever, and it was more a case of their sexual, possibly, attraction to the same gender that was maybe causing them problems or something along those lines. So what it was showing, and actually this was the same in a similar study that was done at the Tavistock in the UK. They showed that most of the children on puberty blockers stayed with the sort of gender dysphoria diagnosis, and therefore went to cross-sex hormones and that. And if you compare those two results, the previous results would show that most of the children don't become trans; they become homosexual or bisexual.
Sure.
But with these studies, you would say, "Whoa, what are we doing here?" This is because it's really hard to be transsexual. You have all sorts of issues with as an adult.
Yes.
They have very poor outcomes. So this is the kind of thing that made people really worry that they were really doing harm. But
so it's really inappropriate use of science, right? This is not a statistically significant thing, and not looking at the alternatives and the. I think this is a common problem in science. You find a study that approves your bias, and you just go with it rather than thinking critically about, okay, but what's the alternative? What are the other things that I need to look at this in contrast to all of the other end results, or in contrast to the whole environment, and understand that maybe this isn't the proper or best solution. So that's definitely a failing, I think.
Yeah, and I think to my impression was that it was very much ideologically driven, because what happened was that trans activists, and there are a lot of transsexuals who thought this was wrong, right? They didn't approve of it, and they got in. They were kind of not liked by their own community for that reason, often, which is horrible. But the trans activists who were, and particularly organizations like Stonewall, who became very active, took a fairly extreme position, which was really that they thought that trans people should essentially have the same rights as the sex that they identify with, and should be treated in the same way. But also, very importantly, they felt that they should get the care that they wanted, which included puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, even though the evidence for that was very, very dodgy. But they were promoting the idea that it was life-saving. I mean, they literally say this, that.
I'm sure in a small minority of cases it may be. I mean, there is certainly extreme psychological.
The funny thing is there's no evidence for that. I mean, there's absolutely no evidence that puberty blockers and transsexual hormones are actually life-saving. If anything, the evidence looks the other way. But what is definitely true is that people who are trans have very high levels of mental illness, whether they're comorbidities, whether they're consequences or causes, we don't really know. And they also have a high level of parasuicide and suicide. Mm-hmm. But the idea that this treatment saves their lives is simply not true. What was true was the idea that any criticism of this treatment, or anyone who tries to stop it, or anyone who says, hang on a minute, that's causing enormous amount of distress, because it's like, I don't know, not accepting that these are trans people, or not accept, and that was completely unfair, because the people that were concerned were people that deeply cared about, the ones I know about anyway, people I know who worked at the Tavistock, and they just thought that this wasn't good for them. And it's been kind of tragic because the surgeons that deal with who do surgery, for example, on trans women, have said that if they've had puberty blockers, they've discovered that they end up with, and this sounds a bit macabre, but they have such small penises that they actually don't have enough tissue to create a good vagina, which is what they do. They use the penis tissue. And as a result, they actually have to use bowel tissue from the rectum and large intestine, and that is much less effective. And so these children end up, these adults, these transsexuals end up with worse outcomes from their surgery because they've taken puberty blockers. So they're saying it's even for them. So even for transsexuals that are transsexuals, that not the ones that have been sort of prevented from normal development and maybe becoming homosexuals or bisexuals, even for them, it's not a good thing. It's disadvantage. So that's kind of a tragic situation.
It is, and I think it's been used as a very effective political tool by the right as well, to tar all of the left with this brush. And I think, as you say, many people on the left are very skeptical of this approach. I think, treating the left as a solid block that supports transitioning adolescents is just wrong. It's not. It's a minority issue.
Yeah, but I have to say that although it's a minority issue, it's quite hard for people on the left. As you know, people tend to adopt a block view. Their package of views of their side, and if there's enough criticism of skepticism, like for example, if people are a bit skeptical about, I know that 3 or 4 years ago, if you were skeptical about medical transitioning in children, you were kind of blasted as being transphobic. So people would just keep quiet about it and wouldn't say anything. It was people on the right that were complaining about it. So you ended up with the left kind of discrediting themselves because they were not unwilling to challenge or make it obvious that these are minority views. And I think the same applies to other extreme views. Like, for example, now the climate alarmism has got, in my view, out of hand. And I think the left is causing real harm to children by making them so concerned about climate change. They think that it's an existential risk to them, and I think in many ways it's driven by a combination of not wanting to be labeled a climate change denier, which is what happens to me all the time, even though I always say climate change is absolutely real and it's caused by, amongst other things, fossil fuel burning. There's no question about that. The only thing I'm questioning is the extent to which people say that we have to eliminate fossil fuels and do it with renewables within by 2050. To me, that just seems insane. And they're driving it by saying, well, if we don't do it, the planet's going to be uninhabitable in 10 to 15 years, which is just complete nonsense. There's just no evidence of that.
The real problems, if you listen to the actual climatologists, are positive reinforcements. You're looking at methane coming out of the permafrost. You're looking at sea level rise. These don't make the world uninhabitable. They certainly create a lot of problems, but the world isn't going to be uninhabitable in 2050. We're going to have, if any of these feedbacks, and these are all based on statistics and our best guess of what's going to happen. 50-50, some of these things at this point. Sure, maybe it's not going to happen. Maybe it is going to happen. You can't say with certainty that these things are going to happen. We may get lucky and nothing will happen, even though we continue burning fossil fuels. But, we are in for a lot of, locked in for sea level rise. We're locked in for extinctions. We're locked in for, feedback. And we don't, nonlinear processes, you just don't know what is going to happen. We don't understand well enough, and we're putting ourselves at risk by So the more we drag our feet on this, the higher the risk that something we didn't expect is going to happen, or something that we thought might happen at a higher level is going to happen. There are realistic concerns. Now, I'm not an alarmist about this, but I think we should be taking every effort reasonable to mitigate these things. And I think what you're highlighting is that there is a balance between doing too much that will cause harm directly in a short term that we know of, and we're not properly weighing the dangers of net zero by 2050 versus the dangers of the climate.
Yeah, I mean,
is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's important to bear in mind that rapidly reducing greenhouse gas production by trying to mainly switch to fossil fuels, and therefore restricting energy, essentially creating kind of relative energy poverty, and restraining economic growth. Those will all have major impacts.
Well, we're seeing it now. All the unrest about rising prices is a lot of that's due to the cost of energy.
Yeah. But I mean, these things will have major, not just the unrest, but they'll actually have major impacts on things like life expectancy and mortality, because economic growth, causes all of those things to improve. So those are definites will happen. And what we're trying to prevent, well, there's two things. One is the projected ones, the mainstream ones that IPCC models predict, in terms of, and there's a lot of work on that. That's, the various different scenarios and how much each one would reduce economic growth, etc. And what people don't seem to realize is that those mainstream ones, right, are really not that bad, because what you're looking at is like a 5 to 10% reduction in economic output in 2100, right? But economic output will be up 200% by then. Whereas with the rapid net zero, where you're restricting economic growth, could result in like a 50%, 60% reduction in economic outgrowth, much bigger. So people don't realize that's the mainstream. So even the mainstream scenarios are not nearly as bad as people seem to think they are. Now, I don't think that's a good enough reason to not reduce CO2 emissions for the reasons that you've highlighted, which are unexpected effects, non-linear effects. For those reasons, I advocate caution, and my view is that the right balance is to use what technology we have and obviously develop new technology to replace fossil fuels where we can do it in a way which doesn't really restrain economic growth. And that seems like a very sensible option. And apart from anything else, just reducing fossil fuels on their own has benefits because the pollution they produce causes a great deal of harm. So you can convince everyone of that. No one is going to deny that it's a good thing to switch to cheaper, clean forms of energy which reduce pollution. Everyone will get on board with that. The problem is that we're trying to push more expensive forms of energy very quickly. And I worry that that's going to undermine the whole climate change thing. You end up with a situation where people saying, let's just drill. Let's just, because they just reject the whole thing, and that's so counterproductive. And my approach has been that we should focus on making cheaper energy that we already know is very clean and reliable. So nuclear energy. And my personal way of trying to deal with that, which not very successful, is knowing, as I'm a pathologist and I study, I'm medically trained, and I understand all the data on risks from air pollution, from radioactivity, from all of those things. The thing that strikes you in the face when you look at all that data is that the level of caution on how air pollution is treated versus radioactivity, I mean, it's like 3 orders of magnitude different. It's just like totally different. And it's just nuts because, it was bad enough before climate change became an issue, but now that we've got this crisis of trying to reduce carbon dioxide, it just seems insane. And, it's so difficult to change it. And I mean, there's four ways in which radioactivity is sort of considered more risky than it probably should be. Some of them are difficult to prove. So the most obvious one that everyone talks about is whether the linear no threshold model is correct. In other words, is radioactivity genuinely as dangerous all the way down to sort of the lowest levels?
Right.
And what I've realized from that is, although it seems very unlikely that that's the case, it's incredibly hard to prove, because the levels of harmful impact that you would be trying to detect at those low levels are just not things that you can detect in population-based surveys. They just can't detect it. So
too many confounding factors.
Yeah. So I think it's just the noise is so much that there's so much. The effect is like you'd expect to see like a 0.05% increase in mortality, and you just can't see that in population.
40% of people get cancer, or 40.05% people get cancer.
Yeah, exactly. It's tiny. It's tiny. You just can't measure it. So that's the one way. The second way is the valuing, what I call valuing a life differently, life lost to radioactivity versus a life lost to air pollution. We have very good data on, what levels of air pollution cause what amount of air mortality and what levels of radioactivity cause. And based on those, the safe level that we set, the target that we set for air pollution as safe versus the one that we set for radioactivity for the public exposed to radioactivity from nuclear power plants, there's about 140-fold difference in the value of life, right? So that's yes. Pretty massive.
If you look at it, like the threshold for evacuating a region due to radioactive release is
that's actually the
below where people are living right now due to air pollution.
Yeah, so that's actually the fourth thing. So I've mentioned the first one was the LNT model. So let's just accept that we can't change that. The second one I measured is the lowest level. There's that we can say with confidence that there's like at least 100-fold difference in the safe level. So the third thing is the dose rate issue. The fact that it's absolutely clear that the dose rate matters. So, for example, if you give a one grade dose, that's why radiotherapy divides it up into fractional doses. So, and the regulations we have, not only do they assume that linear no threshold model is correct, but they assume that it doesn't really matter how long you have the dose over. It's a year. That's the regulation. So we've got three things where we are incredibly cautious, right? Hugely cautious, at least 100-fold, possibly more if you take into account LNT. And I don't think it'll be very easy to change those, okay? Because it's so difficult to do that. But the fourth thing is where I think we should change it, and that is how we react to breaches of those safe levels. And this is the striking thing. Even though the radioactivity thresholds are set so much more conservatively than the air pollution ones, we are far more aggressive at how we deal with breaches of the radioactivity threshold than of the air pollution ones, both in terms of the designs we require for nuclear reactors and that to prevent them ever exceeding those thresholds, which we don't require for things that produce air pollution. And secondly, when there is a breach of those thresholds, how we react. And as you say, we do completely insane things like evacuating the Fukushima exclusion area and people going into Tokyo and Kyoto and whatever, where their risk of death is increased from air pollution.
Yes.
It's insane. And of course,
Yeah,
that
it is.
evacuation process increased mortality because the stress of evacuation, particularly for elderly people, caused about 2,000 extra deaths. So it was all complete. I mean, basically, the caution killed people.
And I think you're right to say that, we're not going to be able to loosen the requirements on nuclear, because how are you going to loosen it when there's so much fear out there? What we should be doing is instead tightening the requirements on fossil fuels so that they have to capture all of their effluent and bury it for 10,000 years. Then we can see which one really is more expensive.
Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, well, the thing is that if we were strict about fossil fuels as nuclear power plants, they'd be shutting down pretty much every single fossil fuel plant, and you wouldn't be able to drive a car. They would be banned, because those levels of pollution would be, far riskier than the kind of level of pollution that you get from a nuclear power plant. So it actually would make it would make energy so expensive that So I think
it levels the playing field, though.
It certainly levels the playing field, but I think a more realistic way of dealing with it is to first of all persuade people that the thresholds that we have for radioactivity are incredibly cautious, much more cautious than for air pollution, and then get people to feel more relaxed, and the regulators to feel more relaxed about potential breaches of those. As I said, the reason why nuclear reactors became more and more expensive, and they didn't seem to, was that as they developed reactors and got experience, they found more and more ways that you could make them safer. And they kept on redesigning and improving designs. And sometimes these happened during the building stages, and sometimes they happened between, building one and then changing the other. And these constant changes in design delayed building, and they also increased the price. And they're completely unnecessary, because nuclear reactors that were built, in the 70s have shown themselves to be incredibly safe. So why are we trying to make them even safer? And to me, that seems to be the most important thing, is if we can get the whole regulatory regime of nuclear reactors, and nuclear waste, which is so incredibly cautious, you can show that it's not appropriate. We can be much less relaxed. It's
killing people.
Yeah, it's killing people, and it's basically stopping us being able to fight climate change. And worse than that, it's causing essentially political unrest, because again, it's the current educated elite that have promoted all of these ideas, and that they haven't changed the bad ones and have adopted worse ones, that are kind of responsible for the situation we're in now, where we've got, like in Europe, a kind of an energy crisis brewing, because as they phase out fossil fuels and nuclear's gone from Germany, and they're trying to switch to renewables, energy instability is increasing, prices are fluctuating, prices are going up all over Europe.
Yes.
And it's causing people to get very upset. They think, well, these guys don't seem to know what they're doing.
It's been a fascinating conversation, Anton, and we could go on for hours, I'm sure. And we continue to do that in social media. So if anyone's interested, come look us up on Facebook or wherever we're discussing these things. But thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about your opinions. Love to talk to you. It was very enlightening, and I hope you enjoyed this as well. Thank you so much.
I did. Thank you very much. Okay.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.